Now back to Outdoors with Larry Ray on ESPN 790. Brought to you proudly by the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, Gaston's White River Resort, and Barton Power Sports.
And welcome back to Outdoors with Larry Ray. I'm Dave Gabbard, one of your co-hosts for this weekend, Open Mic Saturday. As you heard in the last segment, we've let Larry graciously go back to the woods. I guess it'd be to the fields.
Yeah, he's in the
where
field
his
now,
stand
yeah.
is. This morning on Open Mic, with one of our annual Deer Whisperer shows, Larry's, he wants to get that deer while
One
we're
of
on
these
the air.
days.
Yeah, and everything. Got Mr. Gene Smith, our hunter education guru down here in the Memphis area, sitting across from me. Got our webmaster extraordinary guy, Trebo, in the studio with us. Of course, our ever relentless producer, Greg Ratliff, across the window from us, keeping us straight. Yeah. And everything. And our next guest, if you're a reader, probably of Field and Stream, you probably recognize the name. I know I have over the years when some of his columns in there. Got Mr. Jim McCafferty. You with us, Jim?
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Good morning, Jim. Got Jim. Jim's been a long time outdoor writer and has just, has got, a couple of, a brand new book out, that I was looking at. And it's called The Bear Hunter: The Life and Times of Robert Bobo. Yes, sir, that's correct. Correct. One of the old timey bear hunters. That's what a lot of people don't realize here in the South. Through the Delta, up through West Tennessee, and everything. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a lot of bears in this part of the world.
That's true. It was a great bear hunting destination down there in the Arkansas and Mississippi Delta areas. Yes, sir.
And I know that ever in the last couple of decades, the bears that we've had that come up through West Tennessee that our agency has chased around and had to catch, or has come from either Mississippi or Arkansas down there. They get kind of a little Australian gene in them, have a little walkabout, as they say. But tell us about your new book.
I'd love to. Well, I'll tell you, this book is it's primarily about Robert Bobo, Bob Bobo, who was a bear hunter. He lived from 1847 to 1902. He lived in Coahoma County, Mississippi, down there about 70 miles down Highway 61 from Memphis. But the book actually has a lot of Memphis connections as well. In fact, it opens in Memphis in the old Gaston Hotel, which was the building's still there on the south side of Court Square, downtown Memphis. And you've heard the name John Gaston Hospital. That was the same Gaston on the Gaston Hotel. Well, the book opens up with a railroad man named Tom Devine, who was one of the railroad agents there in Memphis. And he had invited an outdoor writer from a magazine called Forest and Stream, which was the premier magazine for outdoor sports of the day. He had invited a writer from Chicago named Emerson Huff, who was quite well known in his time, down to Memphis because he wanted him to meet Bob Bobo and to go bear hunting with him down in the Delta. That was in 1894. Now, the book is centered around Emerson Huff's hunts with Bobo in 1894 and 1895. He spent a good bit of time with him in both those years and then wrote a number of magazine articles for Forest and Stream about his hunts with Bobo. But the book is more than just that. What I've tried to do in the book is give people a picture of life in the Delta country of those days. I have a lot of little asides, I guess you'd call them, in the book, where I'll talk about the environment in which they were hunting. That's something hard for us to imagine today because it really doesn't exist at all.
Right.
The singular feature of the old Delta environment in those days was the cane brake. Now, we're all familiar with cane. It grows up around, you see it a lot, particularly in the Delta, along the old banks, creek banks and bio banks and ditch banks where there's some higher ground. You'll see that cane growing up. But back then, whenever there was some kind of natural opening in the woods, like maybe from a tornado or from a fire, if it was on ground high enough to escape flooding most years, that cane would just grow in a profusion like we can't imagine. There were stretches of it that might be 3 or 4 miles long or even longer and 2 or 3 miles wide. And it was just the closest thing I can give you as an example for it today. If you've seen this ornamental bamboo that will just take over somebody's yard, you know, when they set it out, you've seen that stuff. It was like that. And it was 20 and 30 feet tall in places.
Wow.
Right.
And it just provided an outstanding place for game to hide if they had to hide. But the stuff was so thick, even the game avoided it most of the time unless they had to get in there. Like the bears would hibernate up in there. And so I talk about the Delta environment. I talk about the way of life because, you know, back then the Delta country would flood frequently, the lower ground parts of the Delta. And, you know, just a couple of feet in elevation made a big difference back then between being flooded and not being flooded. And there were no good levee systems back then. And the country would flood, so it was a wilderness until we got a good levee system down there. And, you know, even up to the time of World War II, half of the Mississippi Delta was in woods.
Right.
It's hard for us to think about today. But anyway, I talk about that. And I was focusing on Bobo, as I said, as the vehicle for telling all this. And when Bobo met Emerson Huff at the Gaston Hotel in Memphis, he was introduced to him by a divine who said, "This is the man who killed 304 bears in 1 year." Mm. And so that's what kind of got his attention. In fact, Bobo had been in the press a good bit before that time for his bear hunting. But it was a fun thing to write. I talk about the bear dogs they used, how they bred them. I talk about the horses they used because it was a mounted type hunt these guys conducted. They would turn the dogs loose when they thought they found bear. And they might have 40 or 50 dogs out on a hunt, and they would follow them through the woods and riding at breakneck pace through the woods. You know, where a horse could take a trip, and man, you'd be in trouble. And the dogs, when the dogs bayed the bear, the one thing the bear hunters wanted to do was to protect the dogs. So they would get in there as quickly as possible, try to kill the bear before it could hurt the dogs, because they'd lose a lot of dogs to the bears.
Oh yeah.
And the one thing they often had to do, they didn't want to shoot in close quarters because they didn't want to hit a dog. So a lot of times they would use a knife to kill the bear, which is another thing hard for us to understand today, or hard for us to relate to. But that actually happened. They killed a lot of bears with knives, and I talk about the knives they used. I talk about the way they did it. I talk about one of my favorite things about the book was not just Bobo, but the other little interesting characters I met in the book. One of my favorites was a character named Calvin Belcher, who lived down in Washington County, Mississippi, and this is Queen County. The guy one time, you know, you've heard about these old characters who said they were half wildcat, half alligator,
Right.
all that kind of thing. Well, this is one of those guys. You know, he'd do anything. The man actually tried to ride an alligator across the Yazoo River one time. And that's the kind of people these were. Yeah. But they were fascinating characters. There's another one, a fascinating character from Memphis named George Phelan. In fact, there's a house up in Memphis today, the Hunt Phelan House. I think it was sort of a museum at one time. I'm not sure, but that's the same family. And Phelan wrote quite a bit about some of these old characters, and I drew on some of his writing. A lot of interesting characters in there. The bears themselves were interesting.
Right.
Did I interrupt you there? I didn't mean
no,
to
I just
cut you off.
when you said Bobo was introduced like he killed 300 and something bears in a certain period of time, and I just want people to understand, that they say, man, that's a lot of bears. Why would you kill that many bears? Well, like you said, times were different then. Bears being
they were plentiful.
They were the nuisance wildlife, more or less.
Exactly.
So.
Exactly. It was almost a matter of self-defense that they were killing them. People would ask Bobo to come to their property to get rid of the bears because the bears did two things that really hurt those early settlers. back then they didn't have stock laws, and they let their hogs and cattle roam in the woods, and these bears wore out the hogs. A farmer could not keep hogs hardly for all these bears that were killing hogs. Yeah. Also, they relied on mules and horses for their farm work and their transportation. They plow with the mules, they haul their crops to market with the mules. So they had to grow a lot of corn to feed the mules. And a bear would get in a corn patch and tear half of it up in a single night because they just didn't go in there and eat the corn they needed. They'd go in there and knock the whole thing down. So the farmers were kind of at the mercy of these bears, and they had to keep them in check, and that's one reason they hunted them so much. But I'll tell you this about Bobo. He wasn't doing this out of a, civic view or anything like that. He just loved it.
People like
it was an addictive thing for him.
A passion. I call it a passion.
That's right. It was. That's exactly what it was. I say in the book, he couldn't have quit if he wanted to. He just loved it so much.
Okay, well, how do people get this book? Where can they find it?
Thank you for asking that. I'll tell you, the booksellers in Memphis out there at Poplar and Perkins Extended at Laurelwood Shopping Center, they have been real good to me and taking this book on in the Memphis area, and they're selling them. They've got a good stock of them, and you can get it there. Or if for some reason they run out, you can email me at deltabearhunter@gmail.com.
Okay, well, Jim,
deltabearhunter@gmail.com.
we thank you for joining us. I referred to you the other day. I was talking about you. I said, hey, you're the John Grissom of the outdoor press. When you talk about
I actually went to law school with John Grisham.
Right. I knew you was a graduate from Ole Miss and everything. So we sure appreciate it. And you have a good day. And thanks for joining us on Outdoors with Larry Ray.
I appreciate you too. Thank you. Bye.
Make some time.